Well, thank you for having me here, and thank you to Camera for having me here. As somebody who is in many ways on the front lines of what's going on campuses, I can tell you that Camera is one of only a handful of organizations which really do, on the ground, very solid work with students and really do make a difference on campus. So I'm always happy to speak for Camera whenever I can. My topic today is the history of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And it's very important to understand the history because there is a narrative out there which is very commonly spoken, which is actually not true. My thesis is that the BDS movement is simply the continuation of what is a century, almost a century-old boycott of economic war against the Jews in Israel, which has been repackaged for tactical reasons to appeal to concerns for social justice rather than Jew hatred, which is how it was expressed in the earliest days, or the destruction of Israel, which is how it was expressed during the Arab League boycott. The core of this repackaged narrative that you hear over and over and over again is that BDS is a 1995 call from, I'm sorry, that should not be 1995, the 2005 call from Palestinian civil society. And whenever you hear BDS talk about it, BDS supporters talk about it, faculty talk about it, they always refer to the 2005 call from Palestinian civil society. In fact, if you go to the BDS website, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions has a website. This is a centralized organization, and they have their own website, and they talk about it it being initiated by Palestinian civil society in 2005, July 9, 2005 in particular. And they talk about the groups involved being a clear majority of Palestinian civil society. So they portray it as something new, something that developed in 2005, something very grassroots. The U.S. Campaign to End the Occupation, which has recently rebranded itself as the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Civil Rights, and I'm just using them by way of example, also points to the BDS movement having started in 2005. And this is extremely important to the justification for the BDS movement. The American Studies Association is the only major academic faculty association that has adopted the boycott. And when they did that in December of 1993, the president of the group was interviewed by the New York Times. This is from the New York Times. And he says, of course, one has to, why are you picking on Israel? There's all these other countries which are so much worse. Well, they say one has to start somewhere. And Professor Dershowitz had a great line in response to this, which was, you say that you have to start somewhere, but the BDS movement actually starts and ends with Israel. But the important thing is, if you look at the bottom here, highlighted, they asked, well, what, there are all the justifications you give could be used for many other countries to boycott. In fact, you could use it for the United States if you wanted to. And the president of the American Studies says that one of the reasons that we do it is that in no other country has civil society asked us to boycott. And so this notion of a call from Palestinian civil society is at the core of the BDS justification. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk through the history of the boycotts, and you'll see that it's actually nothing new. It's just a repackaged form of the Arab League boycott of Israel. The history of boycotts against Jews and the British Mandate for Palestine, there were many. This is from, I forget where this is from, I think it was actually a US government publication. You can see going back into the late 1800s, but really it started in 1922. Arab Congress calls on Arabs to boycott Jewish businesses in Palestine. Arab Congress vows to compel Arabs to boycott Jewish merchandise, and so on and so on. So you can see as far back as the 1920s and into the 1930s, this was a boycott of Jews in Palestine. Here are just some documents that I was able to find. The Arabs boycott Jewish electricity. So they'd rather sit in the dark, I guess, than consume Jewish-generated electricity. But that's in 1923. 1929, there was anti-Jewish labor boycott in Palestine. 1929 again, Arab traders urged continuance of the anti-Jewish boycott. So you can see that the boycotts in the early days were anti-Jewish boycotts, always focused on Jews. Again, in 1934, Arab Labor Federation called for a boycott. But the main boycott, at least in our lifetime, has been the Arab League boycott. The Arab League was formed in 1944. In 1945, before Israel even existed, they started a boycott. It clearly wasn't a boycott of Israel because there was no Israel. It was a boycott of Jewish businesses and Jewish entities in what was a few years later to become Israel. The Arab League made very clear in their pronouncements, this New York Times publication, the Arab League announced today that its 7 member states would boycott all Jewish-produced goods from Palestine. So the Arab League boycott started as an anti-Jewish boycott. The Palestine Post in 1946 reported that a particular person was claiming how well the boycott was going against Jewish shops and factories, and that they had to close down because of the anti-Jewish boycott. That was, in this article, disputed that there was such a success. But the whole point is, it was always portrayed as an anti-Jewish boycott. Again, there were threats of bombings against stores that didn't honor the boycott. And how the Arab boycott worked is very important, because you'll see it's actually not that different. It's a slightly different form, but the mechanisms are the same that the BDS movement uses today. The U.S. International Trade Commission produced this chart in 1994, and the boycott was at 3 different levels. There was the primary boycott, the secondary boycott, and the tertiary boycott. These were all administered by an official Arab League office based in Damascus, Syria, which would maintain lists of companies, would maintain blacklists, would monitor all of this activity. So the primary boycott prohibited the importation of goods and services from Israel. So that's very understandable. They would not do business with Israel. The secondary boycott was a boycott of companies that did business with Israel. And so that would, they maintained an actual blacklist of companies. They would monitor and try to find out who is doing business with Israel, and would then maintain a list of those companies. And Arab League countries and businesses in the Arab League countries would be prohibited from doing business with businesses that did business with Israel. And that was, I don't know if I'd call it effective, but it did have an impact, because there were a lot of multinational businesses. Am I going to do business with this country at the time of 4 million people or 5 million people, or am I going to do business with the Arab League of 300 million people, or whatever it was at the time, 200 million? Obviously, you can sell a lot more cars to 200 million people than you can to 4 million people. And so there were many companies that refused to do business in Israel because they didn't want to find themselves on a blacklist. That I do recall, and I think it was Coca-Cola, I can't remember, but one of the soda companies I remember you couldn't buy in Israel because they didn't want to get put, Pepsi, okay, it was Pepsi. I kind of guess at that each time I'm up here, and I usually guess wrong somehow. And there were car companies, too, that wouldn't. Then there's the tertiary boycott, which is a little harder to understand, but it's boycott prohibits business dealings with firms that do business with blacklisted companies. So here's how far down and deep it went. Okay, can't do business with Israel, can't do business with a company that does business in Israel. You boycott a company that does business in Israel, and you boycott anyone who does business with a company that does business in Israel. And this had a very, instilled terror in the marketplace, if you want to put it that way. That's how deep down it went. You didn't just have to do business with Israel to run yourself afoul. If you did business with somebody who did business in Israel. And that was the Arab League boycott. It was relatively silent in the early years, relatively ineffective. And we, of course, have to note that there was no boycott of companies doing business in the occupied, what's now called the West Bank, controlled by Jordan, or Gaza, controlled by Egypt. So this was not an occupation-based boycott. It was not a territorial-based boycott. It was an anti-Jewish boycott, as the Arab League's own statements made very clear. The Arab League boycott was largely ineffective for the first couple of decades. It became most effective in 1973 during the Arab oil embargo, when Arab countries began to control essentially the world's oil supply, and so became very wealthy. And there was a serious threat, if you were going to be blocked out of doing business with people who financially seemed to control the world at the time, in terms of oil wealth, that it became much more effective. And now it began to have a real impact. And what happened is that in the US, in the late 1970s, there were numerous pieces of legislation passed because the Arab oil wealth backing up the boycott, Arab League boycott, was beginning to have, at least potentially, a very significant impact. And this, I think, is a good history to show you that legislation can have an effect. I know there's a lot of legislation percolating around now, but there is a history of protecting allies, including Israel, through US legislation from threats of economic boycott. So this is nothing new. It happened in the 1970s. There was federal legislation, which is fairly complicated legislation. Didn't necessarily make it a crime to adhere to the Arab boycott, but there were reporting requirements. You'd have to report whenever you were requested as a company to honor the boycott. You actually had to report that request. You had to fill out forms every year about whether you were engaging in the boycott or not. There could be potential penalties. But and there was an anti-boycott office set up. I forget which department in the US government it was under, but there was an anti-boycott. And so this sort of legislation, also at the state level, particularly New York and California, added discrimination based on national origin to their boycott provision. So they already had legislation that said it was unlawful to boycott somebody based on race or based on other factors. And they added to those statutes national origin. In New York, there's a statute now that makes it unlawful to boycott someone based on national origin. That statute has never been enforced as such, but because it's on the books, it has a significant impact. And I know that personally because our local JVP people up in Ithaca tried to mount a boycott at the Green Star Food Co-op of Israeli goods. And we made a presentation to the board in writing, and we cited the statute. And they got independent legal opinions from two separate law firms. So they wanted to really button this down, who both advised them that allowing such a referendum, even to go to the membership for a vote, arguably violated the New York anti-discrimination law and could subject them to litigation. The board, based on that legal advice from their own lawyers, decided not even to allow the referendum to go to a membership vote. And they also then announced that they were going to reconsider the earlier referendum they had passed boycotting Chinese goods. Ithaca has a very big Tibetan community. The Dalai Lama's Western Hemisphere retreat is like 10 miles from Ithaca. So many years ago, they got a Chinese boycott passed. But my point is, legislation has a huge impact. And I think the legislation that's going through the states now, and apparently there might be federal legislation, could have a very, very important impact. And it did on the Arab boycott. It didn't eliminate it completely, didn't destroy it, but it now raised the stakes for companies who were going to capitulate to it. that they now faced potential federal problems if they did so, potential lawsuits for discrimination, etc. By the mid-1990s, the Arab League boycott was essentially defunct. Yes, they still had the office, they still went through the motions, but a combination of the US legislation, the peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan, and the Oslo Accords essentially eliminated the effectiveness of the Arab League boycott, because now you had Arab countries who were key members of the Arab League doing business with Israel, maybe not a lot of business, but at least in theory, they were supposed to be doing business with Israel. And it was the reality of the Israeli economy that it was becoming very difficult to actually boycott Israeli products, because you can't buy a computer if you're going to do that. At least if you're going to do it honestly and you're going to actually adhere to your boycott. So a combination of these things made it essentially eliminated the Arab League boycott. And this article from the New York Times talks about how, though it's still in effect, the economic boycott weakens, and it talks about how Israel was expanding trade, et cetera, et cetera. But by the 2001, there was already a lot of talk about reactivating the Arab League boycott. The Oslo Accords had somewhat stalled. There was no indication that Israel was going to be eliminated. The Arab League boycott was ineffective. And so there was talk back then. This is an article from ADL at the time talking about how the boycott was put on the agenda of the March 26th, that would be 2001, Arab League meeting in Amman, Jordan. According to media reports, in February of 2001, the Arab League's Central Office for the Boycott of Israel sent invitations to its liaisons office regarding a meeting for April in 2001 in Damascus. So the Arab countries and the anti-Israel forces were becoming very frustrated that despite having boycotted Jews and Israel for several decades, Israel seemed to be doing just fine. There was no weakening of Israel, and they wanted to reactivate somehow the boycott of Israel. And the way they did it was through what we will now call the BDS movement. And they did it by using by creating a non-governmental structure through which to boycott Israel. Because if you read the US anti-boycott legislation, the federal legislation, it refers to country-sponsored boycotts. So a boycott not sponsored by a country would not be subject to the US federal anti-boycott legislation. So they created a structure which is a non-governmental structure to now implement the boycott of Israel. And they did so through what I call captive NGOs, non-governmental organizations. NGO is kind of a hot term that students love to throw around. When you have the Syrian Lawyers Association under the rule of, Hafez Assad, it's really just a captive organization. It's not truly non-governmental. It's not like the American Bar Association. So a lot of these NGOs throughout the Arab and Muslim world were essentially extensions of the government who were able to present themselves as being non-governmental organizations. And they also utilized the UN apparatus against Israel. And they did that through the pre-Durban and the Durban conferences, and they came up with an idea that the way they were going to now attack Israel was not based on the old religious narrative of Jew versus Muslim, the old nationalistic analysis of Arab League versus Jewish state. They were going to do it by means of portraying Israel as an apartheid state and using the apparatus and the structures that had been created to boycott South Africa, but to use them against Israel through non-governmental organizations and the UN. And that was laid out at the pre-Durban and Durban conferences. The Durban conference in 2001, you probably know, was the UN conference on anti-racism, which turned into such a debacle, anti-Semitic debacle, the US actually walked out of it. It was really a horrible thing. But that is the structure they then used. Arab and Muslim governments acting through captive NGOs. and some true believers among left-wing Western NGOs who weren't captive to them. The key conference was the 2001 Tehran Conference. Has anybody here heard of the 2001 Tehran Conference? Okay, one person, 2 people, 3 people. Okay, most people have not. Okay, this is where the BDS movement started, in Iran. Israeli delegation was not allowed. Jewish NGOs were not allowed. Some other Western NGOs who were considered too friendly to Israel were not allowed to attend. And this was a preparatory regional conference, and there were many, there were several, leading up to the Durban Conference. Mary Robinson, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, not considered a friend of Israel, very controversial in her own way. She wrote a year or so ago in the Daily Beast a very interesting column, essentially an excerpt from a book she had written. So she was promoting a new book she had written, and she wrote this column about the Tehran Conference. And this shows how it all started there, this whole apartheid narrative. It had been clear to me early on that one of the 4 regional conferences, the Asian PrepCom in Tehran, would be problematic. No one could have seen that coming. Iran, chosen by countries of the region, was a poor choice to hold a conference addressing issues of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism because of its known hostility to Israel. Tactically, it would have been better to move it elsewhere, elsewhere in the region, but no other government would accept it because they had their own human rights problems. In its PrepCom session, Mary Robinson writes, the Tehran meeting, Israel was harshly criticized for policies in the Palestinian territories and its treatment of Palestinians, and made an analogy between those policies and apartheid. She goes on. The Zionist movement, the, quote, Zionist movement is based on race superiority, close quote, the draft declaration subsequently alleged, along with the charge that Israel had carried out ethnic cleansing of Arab population of historic Palestine, close quote. All such sentences were opposed by some delegates, and as is always the UN procedure, were put in square brackets in the text, indicating they'd not been agreed upon. At the time, I felt certain this inflammatory language would be removed from further drafts. Unfortunately, it wasn't. So the draft not agreed upon language inserted at the Tehran Conference never was removed. And so all of these allegations of Israel apartheid, Israel ethnic cleansing, Israel genocide, all of those accusations, which are now commonly alleged in the BDS movement, started at the Tehran Conference. She says, looking back, I realize I put too much store in the fact that any controversial clauses put in brackets would either be removed or inevitably removed through debate. And that didn't happen. The Durban NGO Conference was in September 2001, and there were multiple aspects of the overall Durban Conference, but they had a specific NGO conference. And it's very important that this anti-Israel stuff went through the NGO conference controlled by these captive NGOs. The late Congressman Tom Lantos wrote an article shortly after it for the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs. He attended the conference. Another ring in the Durban circus was the NGO Forum, taking place just outside the conference center. Although the NGO proceedings were intended to provide a platform for a wide range of civil society interested in the conciliatory mission, the forum quickly became stacked with Palestinian and fundamentalist Arab groups. Each day, these groups organized anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic rallies around the meetings, attracting thousands. One flyer, which was widely distributed, showed a photograph of Hitler and the question, what if I had won? And the answer was there'd be no Israel. At a press conference held by Jewish NGOs to discuss their concerns, the Arab Lawyers Union, again, this would be completely captive of the Arab countries, although it's technically an NGO, distributed a booklet filled with anti-Semitic caricatures, frighteningly like those seen in the Nazi hate literature in print in the 1930s. Jewish leaders and I who were in Durban were shocked at this blatant display of anti-Semitism. For me, having experienced the horrors of the Holocaust firsthand, this was the most sickening and unabashed display of hate for Jews I'd seen since the Nazi period. Sadly, but perhaps not surprisingly, the official NGO document that was later adopted by a majority of the NGOs branded Israel a racist apartheid state, guilty of genocide, and called for an end to its racist crimes against Palestinians. Another observer there, Gay McDougall, wrote, "I join with Congressman Lantos and other critics who rightly condemn the anti-Semitism that some groups brought to the NGO forum. There was an atmosphere of intimidation and hate against Jewish people. There were cartoons and posters that were hurtful and inappropriate. Additionally, the final NGO document contains language relating to Israel that was inflammatory, etc." In fact, the Durban NGO Conference document, the boycott call, is the BDS boycott call. Call for launch of an international anti-Israeli apartheid movement as implemented against South African apartheid through a global solidarity campaign network of international civil society. That'll give you a clue as why Palestinian, quote-unquote, civil society would then be organized. UN bodies and agencies, business communities to end the conspiracy of silence, call upon international community to impose a policy of complete and total isolation of Israel as an apartheid state. That's where this accusation of Israeli apartheid, that's why they now have Israel Apartheid Week on some campuses. That's why the word is thrown around every sentence that they speak. The Durban strategy of BDS, the Durban strategy is the strategy of the BDS movement. And you have to understand, just like the anti-Jewish boycotts in the 20s and 30s, the anti-Jewish Arab League boycott, this was the result of an openly anti-Semitic agenda conceived in Tehran and born in Durban, which reframed the argument in terms of being anti-racism and pro-human rights. But don't take my word for it that the Durban Conference is the start of the BDS movement. In reality, Noura Erakat, a lawyer, very well-known Palestinian-American lawyer, somebody who's in the lead of fighting against legislation and things like that, a very prominent person in the movement, wrote in 2010, the call, talking about the Palestinian civil society call in 2005, which I'll get to, gave voice to a growing movement that began appropriately in Durban, South Africa in 2001. In Durban and subsequently, the activists have drawn upon the general definition of apartheid. So it's not just me saying that the BDS movement is implementing the Durban agenda. It's one of their leading attorneys, one of their leading activists acknowledging that that's the history. But the boycott activity using the Durban strategy started almost immediately. It did not wait for Palestinian civil society. I'll just go through a few articles. 2002, the Intifada reaches the ivory tower, talking about how the initiative to boycott Israel academically began with students from the University of California at Berkeley and recently spread to places such as Princeton. Israel boycott in Britain was beginning to get underway. This article's from July of 2002. British-led petition of more than 700 academics. South African professor attacks Israel apartheid regime. That's 2002. You can see the academic boycott has always been at the lead of this. The British publisher boycotts Bar-Ilan University. This is in 2002. British academic boycott of Israel gathers pace, 2002. It was significantly generating enough publicity that Senator Corzine introduced a resolution in the Senate, not legislation, just a resolution condemning it as reflected in the congressional record in October 2002. So the boycott, using the language of Durban, started immediately. It did not wait for Palestinian civil society to issue a call. Lecturers' Union to debate boycott of Israel. What happened is 2002 through 2004, the people who would now call themselves the BDS movement started to organize Palestinian civil society. And but the boycott was already underway. The Durban boycott was already underway. In July 2004, there was an initial call for boycott. That was by academics, of course. Palestinian academics call for international academic boycott of Israel. That's July 2004. But the final BDS boycott call, the one I read to you at the beginning, that everybody cites as the reason there is a BDS movement, the reason there was in response to a call from Palestinian civil society, that is a flat-out lie. We know that the boycott using the Durban strategy had been going on for several years. BDS movement, again, cites, has it posted as of July 9, 2005. Palestinian civil society calls for the boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel until it complies with international law and universal principles of human rights. A standard which, of course, can never be met because somebody could find any country doing something that violates international law. Palestinian civil society calls for BDS against Israel until it complies, with these standards. The BDS final declaration, this is the one they all cite as the reason they're boycotting Israel. We, representatives of Palestinian civil society, call upon international civil society organizations. And remember, civil society was one of the entities that needed to be organized under the Durban boycott call. People of conscience all over the world to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment strategies against Israel, similar to those applied to South Africa in the apartheid era, etc. These nonviolent punitive measures should be maintained until Israel meets its obligations, including ending its occupation and colonization of all Arab lands. And that is the one, the vagueness, what does that mean of all Arab lands? Does that mean Tel Aviv and Haifa? Or what does that mean? And that was deliberately left vague because it allows Western liberals to say, oh, that only means the West Bank and Gaza. But it allows others to say, no, that means all of Israel. So it was deliberately vague. But the thing to understand is that this is all implementing the Durban strategy. Even the organization of civil society as a tactic was demanded by the Durban boycott call. The first official conference for the boycott of Israel, pursuant to the 2005 call, was in 2007. First Palestinian conference for the boycott of Israel. And very interesting, the conference was opened by Dr. Gabi Baramki, who reminded participants of the fact that boycott has been a tool of the Palestinian struggle since the 1920s, tying it right back in to what I've been saying, which is that this is just a repackaged version of the anti-Jewish boycotts going back to the 1920s. And it's not just me saying it, it's the keynote speaker at the first Palestinian BDS conference in 2007. The core tactics of BDS are similar, not 100% identical, to the Arab League boycott, primary, secondary, and tertiary boycotts. Primary is obviously boycotting Israeli goods. So if there's an Israeli product on the shelf, they'll put stickers on it, they'll tear it off the shelf, they'll try to disrupt it, they won't buy it, etc. The secondary is really where I think most of the BDS action is nowadays. It's boycotting companies that do business with Israel. And you see that all over the social media these days. Some company does business in Israel, therefore we're going to boycott it. Although they are a little bit more selective now because it plays better, they'll accuse the company of participating in Israel crimes, et cetera, et cetera. They'll do HP because HP provides software or key cards or something that are used at checkpoints. So they're a little bit more subtle than they used to be, but not always. Sometimes if it's from Israel, that's enough for them. And there is a sense of the tertiary boycott, which is boycotting people who do business with those who do business in Israel. You might look at some of the anti-normalization activities that go on. For example, the artist Matisyahu, who's not even Israeli, he's Jewish, but he has a lot of ties to Israel, was barred from a music festival, this was about 2 years ago, in Spain, under pressure from local BDS groups because he had done some fundraisers, concerts, for I think Friends of the IDF and some other groups. And so it was because he did business with people who they blacklist as doing business with Israel, he was boycotted. That was overturned because there was a huge uproar. The Sabra hummus boycott makes zero sense, very little sense unless you understand how multi-leveled the boycott is. Sabra hummus is not made in Israel. It's made in the US. Its main factory is in Virginia. It's been a boon to farmers in the Pacific Northwest who grow chickpeas. It's mostly owned and controlled by PepsiCo, but one of the owners is the Strauss Group in Israel. And because of that connection, there's a movement to keep Sabra hummus, which controls 60% of the market, out of dining halls in colleges, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very much like the Arab League structure. It's not enough if you do business with Israel, but if you do business with somebody who does business with Israel under the BDS movement, that could be enough to get you in trouble. And here's how it's structured. They attack people who fund Israel. They attack Israeli companies and products. They attack corporations which have investments in Israel. They are always trying to get resolutions passed, and obviously there's a lot to the BDS boycott that I don't have time to get into now. Very interesting, they are even in the process now of compiling what is similar to the old Arab League blacklist of companies, except they're doing it through the UN. Groups like Human Rights Watch are participating in adding names to the list of companies that do business in settlements, which is going to end up looping in a large number of Israeli companies because they do business with people who buy their stuff. And that is almost inevitably going to include people living beyond the 1949 Green Line. And those companies, so this blacklist that's being created supposedly of companies doing business in occupied territories is actually going to end up being a new Israel blacklist. So they're even rehabilitating the old Arab League boycott, but they're doing it in such a way that it's not subject to US legislation. It's actually through the UN Human Rights Council. And you have these NGOs participating in creating the blacklist, which is very ironic because when various states pass laws barring investment in companies that boycott Israel or boycott allies, they say, well, you're creating a blacklist. You can't do this. But that's exactly what they're doing against Israel. Academic boycott guidelines, and I'm pretty much out of time, so I'll just run through these quickly, is another example of how deep it runs and how similar it is to the Arab League boycott. It's not just at the surface. It's below. Refrain from participating in any form of academic and cultural cooperation, collaboration, joint projects, barring Israeli entities from conferences, etc. The current status of BDS, presumably some other speakers will talk about that, but in the US at least, Europe's a different story. It exists only on campuses and faculty organizations as a practical matter. The only place they've ever gotten any traction is with faculty organizations. Every year they're trying to get some new faculty group to pass the boycott call, and they do it because these organizations don't have any counterbalancing interests, unlike a university which has students, non-BDS faculty, alumni, community, parents, who all get input in these faculty organizations, which are run and controlled by the pro-BDS faculty. They really control the situation. So to wrap up before we get to questions, my original thesis was that it's a century-old history of boycotts that shows that BDS is the latest form of economic war against the Jews, been repackaged for tactical reasons to appeal to concerns for social justice rather than Jew hatred or destruction of Israel. And hopefully I've at least made some progress in showing that. Thank you.
We've had a few questions submitted. The first one is, to what extent is Palestinian civil society actually active in BDS?
As far as I can tell, not very much. It's mostly run by international NGOs. There are some groups in Ramallah. There's a boycott office in Ramallah, so there's some involvement. But, and this was a criticism of the BDS movement voiced rather eloquently by a group called New York City Students for Justice in Palestine, which is the most radical SJP group that I've ever seen. They're not affiliated with any particular school, they're just an umbrella group. And they criticized, they said, this BDS movement is a joke as it's currently constituted. It is simply Western liberal NGOs creating a show so they can continue to get more funding. And that is, and they were met with scowls of accusations against them. But this is mostly an international NGO driven. There are dozens of groups supporting the BDS movement that get funds either directly or indirectly from governments and foundations, and they have a vested interest in keeping this going. There's relatively little activity that I've seen by actual Palestinian groups. There are certain activists whose careers are dedicated to making sure BDS continues, and they travel around campuses and they give speeches, but there's very little actual Palestinian civil society involvement.
Next question. Many states in America are passing anti-BDS laws. Could this have an impact in reducing BDS activity on the campuses of public colleges?
Well, I don't think so, because they're normally phrased, and they should be phrased in a way that, you know, does not infringe on First Amendment rights of speech. But I do think it sets a public policy and a public agenda, and so I do think they're helpful. I do think they're important. Some have been, not recently, there were some proposed 3-4 years ago that were way overbroad. As long as they're narrowly crafted, we have a right as a country. Our government has a right as being elected by the people to establish trade policy, establish investment principles. And the BDS movement can't say, you know, we're for socially responsible investing, and we don't want the university or the government to invest in an Israeli country, but then complain when we say, well, we actually disagree with you. We're for socially responsible investing too, and we don't want to invest in the BDS movement. So you can't demand that sort of government involvement, which they always do. They're always trying to get governments to sign on to this, usually local councils. So I think it does have a positive effect. I think it sets an agenda, and it sends a message to the world. Just like the 1970s federal legislation really didn't have a lot of teeth in it, but it sent a message to the multinational business community that if you're going to join the Israel boycott, you're going against our policy. So I think they're very helpful, and I think they should continue.
A short question. Do boycotts work to offset boycotts? Yeah, these efforts, B-U-Y, cuts, to make a point of buying
okay.
Israeli products.
You have to understand, BDS has not had a significant, yet, certainly in the United States, and I'm addressing everything to the US right now, has not had a meaningful economic impact on Israel. We boycott Israel every time we buy a computer and a cell phone and a whole host of other products. But I think the answer is a different form of boycott, which is, you know, to invest in the relationship between U.S. universities and Israeli universities. Rather than putting your name on a building or on a classroom, establish an exchange program, establish those ties. So for every negative divestment, and there aren't that many of them, I mean, you can count them on one or two hands a year, for every negative resolution that passes a student government, rather than just screaming about it, do something to further establish the relationship between Israeli and U.S. universities. That's the best answer.
Okay, two questions that relate to each other. Please discuss how BDS is funded, and much financial support of anti-Israel activity comes from European governments. How are efforts proceeding to get these European governments to desist from this funding?
There's a lot to those questions. As relates to what goes on directly in campus, and we were talking about this last night, a lot of the money for these student groups comes from the universities. You can establish your local SJP chapter, and you can get your 2,500 or 5,000 or 10,000, just like every other group who's a registered student group. So a lot of their money comes from the university itself. There's another level to it, which is more the BDS movement, the international apparatus that coordinates all these things. And it's truly, if you spend any time researching this, the number of organizations, the breadth of the anti-Israel movement is truly astounding. It never ceases to amaze me. Somebody is funding those groups. They're not student groups on universities. And that's always been one of the dark holes in the analysis, is who's funding. Certainly some of them come from European governments. That's been well documented by NGO Monitor, that organization. And some of it comes from major foundations, the Rockefeller Foundation, other groups like that, donate money to groups that engage in these activities. But how they pay for all this international apparatus they have, I think, is something of a mystery.
Do you think the relocation of SodaStream was the result of the boycott?
I think it was. I mean, they're trying to say no, but how can you say no? I think it probably was.
And how would you rate the economic damage versus the ideological damage from BDS?
Well, that's trying to assess what is the threat of BDS. In the U.S., it's virtually no economic threat whatsoever. In Europe, that's not necessarily true. I mean, they have made some progress at the governmental level in Europe at cutting off relations to some level. And I think what you're seeing now with the Plan B, if you want to call it that, which is only boycott, things coming, products coming from the West Bank, only, boycott companies that do business there, is a stepping stone to something broader. So I think in Europe it's something of a threat, but I wouldn't overstate it, at least publicly at the top political level. European governments are against BDS. So I don't think it's much of an immediate economic. And you always hear, they're always overhyping. One thing you have to understand about the BDS movement is no matter what happens, they always declare victory. So if they lose a resolution on a campus, they say, well, actually, this is a victory for us because we got people to talk about the issue. They will never acknowledge anything as a defeat. And they overhype the economic impact. They're always citing like, there's a study that says BDS could cost the Israeli economy $24 billion. But if you actually look at the study, that's a study that if the European Union were to boycott Israel, it would cost Israel $24 billion. That's a long, that's a fantasy in a sense. So yes, worst case scenario, but they present worst case scenario as like about to happen because that's how they motivate people. One of their chants they always do, and I love the phraseology of it. They chant, "We believe that we will win. We believe that we will win." And that gets their people motivated. So I think a lot of the hype around BDS is overstated. I view it more as an ideological threat that could materialize over time, a generational threat. I've never seen, and I look at all these Pew studies and so on, I've never actually seen enough hard data to lead me to believe that we're losing the younger generation. I think anecdotally, I think there is less sympathy, less support for Israel among younger generations. But I don't know whether that's new or it's always been that way. So I've never really seen hard enough data that tracks it historically. Certainly among the U.S. general population, Israel's at a historic high. If you look at the Gallup polls, and Gallup's great because they've been asking the same questions for 20 years. So you can see how it progresses historically. And among the lower age groups, and unfortunately Gallup's lower age group is such a wide range, it's not totally useful. I think it's like, 21 to 35. I mean, it's just too broad. But among that lowest one that they measured, there's been no slippage in support for Israel. And so I don't know, but I do believe that the narrative of Israel being an apartheid state, genocide, et cetera, is something that I do worry about taking hold. And this problem, BDS has been repeating the apartheid line, as we know, since 2001. They've been doing it now for 15 years. And I think there is a general sense among younger people, perhaps not as supportive of Israel. And that's why I always say this was not a problem created overnight, and it won't be solved overnight. And I think that's why the educational efforts that people do on campuses are, one, very beneficial. Yes, we have to fight a divestment resolution and so on, but that's not the long-term problem. The longer-term problem is this narrative, heavily pushed by faculty. Departments, particularly in the humanities, not all of them, but many, have been completely taken over by BDS faculty. They drive a lot of these issues. Then they hide behind academic freedom to protect themselves. You almost have to create a counter-educational experience for people on campuses because Israel is not going to get a fair shake within the classroom. And so I think those sort of efforts, but it has to be sustained. It has to be, a 10-year program, a 15-year program. It can't just be, okay, next semester we're going to do this, and then we're going to move on to something else. And that's why I think the efforts of CAMERA, other groups too, on campus to create those educational opportunities. I will say, and I can't measure it, but I think some people share this feeling with me. I think BDS on campus may have overplayed their hand. I think people are sick of them. I think they are sick of every semester having the student government taken over by these issues. I think they're really just sick of it. And so I can't measure that, but I do have that sense. So I worry about the ideological long-term as opposed to next semester.
Now, a very specific question. I wondered about this myself because I didn't realize the American Studies Association had engaged in this so long ago. What is the current status of the organization?
The first group to do it was the Association for Asian American Studies in May of 2013. And I think I may have been the only one to actually pay attention to this and tried to get attention. But he said, this is some crazy organization, ignore it, it's not a big deal. And it's a very good example of how they operate. They spend years taking over small faculty organizations. I mean years. First they take over committees. They get their people on committees. Then they get their people on the national council of these groups. So, and it's all the same people. It's maybe 50 people who do this from group to group. And because their academic areas are so overlapping, they're members of the Asian American Studies group. They're members of the American Studies group. They're members of all these different groups. So that was a vote at their annual meeting. You had to, whoever showed up in a specific room at a specific time got to vote at their annual meeting. It was a unanimous decision, okay, Asian American Studies. The same people who ran Asian American Studies were heavily involved with American Studies. By their own account, they spent 4 years organizing the Boycott at American Studies. First, they took over committees. Then they created a new committee called the Activism Committee at American Studies. Then they got their people on the National Council. Since only a committee can recommend a resolution go to the membership, they controlled the committee. The activism committee recommended the boycott resolution. When it was announced in October, November of 2013, they had all their supporters lined up. They had already had people join the organization. They controlled the National Council. And when I'll say pro-Israel professors, but I wouldn't even say necessarily pro-Israel, the ones who didn't want their organization being turned into this political vehicle wanted to present and have emailed out to the membership alternative arguments and literature. National Council wouldn't allow it. They only sent out the pro-boycott literature. It then went to an online vote, and of 4,000 roughly, I've seen varying numbers, call it 4,000 members eligible to vote, only 1,200 voted. And of course, who votes in these things? The people who are motivated. Who is motivated? The ones who were anti-Israel. So of the 1,200 who voted, 800 voted for, 400 against. So 800 out of a 4,000 membership got the resolution passed and committed American studies to this boycott. Since then, there was a huge amount of pushback. No other major organizations, a couple of smaller ones run by the same people. I think the Native American Studies Association, some other smaller ones, but they've come very close and they're constantly pushing it. They lost by a very small margin last spring at the American Anthropological Association. It passed the business meeting, which meant it gets sent to the membership. When I say small, I think they lost by a few hundred votes out of like 10,000 who voted, or several thousand who voted. They came very, very close. This January, there's a vote at the Modern Language Association on a boycott. And what's very interesting is that for the first time, there are two counter resolutions being introduced. One is to condemn Palestinian universities for violation of academic freedom. And I'm trying to remember what the third is, but it's a third one essentially coming out against academic boycotts. And so there's various tactics, but they have tried at the American Historical Association, but it did not pass the business meeting. Business meeting is at, the last day of their annual meeting, they've got a business meeting, and that's where a lot of this stuff takes place. It has not come, so no other major group has done it. The American Association of University Professors, which is the largest organization, has come out against academic boycott, not just of Israel, but of any country. I think it's going to present a very difficult problem for these groups moving forward because Turkey just pretty much rolled up half of their academics and put them in prison. And how are you wanting to boycott Israel? Why aren't we also boycotting Turkey? So I don't think it's gone very far, but they keep trying.
Okay, one last question. And unfortunately, it might be hard to answer briefly, but please try. Do you have a strategy to convince students not to support BDS, and what might work? Yes,
bring them to Israel. Best program I've seen to date is, I don't know who's funding it, somebody's funding it, it's a great idea. You don't have to be Jewish. They are taking groups of law students to Israel over winter break. Last year was the first time Cornell did it. Sold out because it's heavily subsidized. It's cheap for the students. 50 Cornell law students went there. Several have approached me and said it was like the best thing they ever did. Non-Jewish students, okay? They've sold out again this year. I've heard that program is very successful. The best thing you can do, and I'm not talking about birthright, which is perfectly good, is bring people to Israel. That's the best thing to fight the academic boycott. Bring professors there. Bring people there.